the Korban Tamid, the Korban Musaf. Now remember, Tuma was Lav Dafka a problem because they did have the Paraduma. So we don't even have to invoke Tuma Hutra B'tzibor in that particular scenario, right? Paraduma was there, no problem. But the machlokas was, could they bring korbanos without a Beis HaMikdash? Because no Beis HaMikdash was built at that particular time, because it just says they built a Mizbeach. So you'll remember that the machlokas in the Gemara is that according to one opinion, they did put up a makeshift building with curtains and rods and the like, because they wouldn't have been able to be makriv korbanos unless there's also a Beis HaMikdash, because the Kedushas HaMikdash lapsed when there was korban, and therefore they had to do a makeshift Beis HaMikdash. The other opinion says, no, they could be makriv on the Makam HaMizbeach, even if there is no Beis HaMikdash, because the Kedushas HaMikdash remains even after the Chorban. Right, so that's the machlokas. Basically, when you read that they built a Mizbeach, according to one opinion, they also did a makeshift Mikdash, with Kodesh HaKadoshim and everything. According to the other opinion, there was no bias at all. La halacha, this is a machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid. According to the Rambam, the Kedushas HaMikdash even applies when there's no Beis HaMikdash. According to the Ravid, there is no Kedushas HaMikdash after the Chorban. Right, so machlokas Rambam and the Ravid. So again, just to chazir quickly, I'll mention something new in a moment. So you'll recall that the Isser of a Tameh going into the Makam HaMikdash, Bizman Hazeh, is only true according to the Rambam. According to the Ravid, it is mutter. According to the Ravid, it's mutter, even in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And the reason why we tell people they're not allowed to go, again, I'm not referring to the whole HaRav, that's another shayla, but we're not allowed to go in the Makam HaMikdash of the HaRav, is because, as Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, Ein biyadenu lahachriya, we don't have the power to make a decision between the Rambam and the Ravid. Now, I understand in the way halacha is declared today, it is usually declared without subtlety and without refinement. So you'll hear a statement that says, anyone who goes on the HaRav today is chayiv kares. You will hear this as a categorical, absolute statement. There are two reasons why that statement is not true. Two separate reasons why it's not a true statement. Reason number one is that part of the HaRav is the Levite camp, Machne Leviah. So Bichlal, a Tamei Meis is allowed to go, even though we may not know the precise boundaries. So to make a blanket statement, anyone who goes on any part of the HaRav is Chayiv Kares is absolutely not true, because there are parts of the HaRav that technically you're allowed to go, even if you'd be advised not to take your chance. But the second reason why it's not totally emes is, even in the Makam HaMikdash itself, you're only going to be Chayiv Kares according to the Rambam Shita. You're not going to be Chayiv Kares according to the Ravid Shita. Now, it's true, since we don't have the koach to be machriya between the Rambam and the Ravid, we're supposed to be machmir, but it's not a true statement to say that for sure you're Chayiv Kares. Like the Ravid, it actually is going to be mutter. Bizman hazeh. Now, in terms of can you bring korbanos bizman hazeh, right? Can we, if somebody would be, by the way, did you see it last Shavuos? Last Shavuos? No, it was the Shavuos, not the Shavuos, a year ago Shavuos. Some guys from the Temple Institute actually brought the shtei halechem, 2 loaves of bread. They had to go all the way into the mosque because they had to go to the Makam HaMizbeach. They waved the loaves of bread. They were wearing Big Day Kahuna. They were Kohanim. And the police were chasing after them. I mean, it looked like a Keystone Cops chase, where they're holding these 2 loaves of bread and they're running around. The police are trying to tackle them, and they somehow escaped. But they point out that Chazal say that the bringing of the Shtei Halechem causes rainfall, very good rainfall in Eretz Yisrael. Now, you know that this past winter, the rain was a bit unusually heavy. It was heavier than usual, and some attribute it to the Shtei Halechem that was brought on Shavuos. Who knows? I don't know. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that there are 2 things that happened. They're not necessarily related, but maybe they are. Shtei Halechem on Shavuos and Geshamim during the during the next winter. If they try it this year, I didn't hear about that. It could be the police are more vigilant, and they want to be sure that that doesn't happen. But what is the issue of korbanos? So here is the issue. The problem is this. According to the Ravid, for sure you could not bring korbanos on the site of the temple for a very simple reason. Since that site does not have kedusha, halachic kedusha, then bringing a korban there would be like bringing a korban here, and there would be an iser dioraisa of shechutei chutz. Now, this may sound a little funny, and it is a little funny, because what do you mean? I bring a korban in the makam of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's the avera of bringing a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash? I mean, that sounds a little odd, but according to the Ravid, that's exactly the situation. Because if the makam hamikdash does not have halachic kedusha, then you're not bringing the korban in the makam hamikdash. So according to the Ravid, there's absolutely no heter at all. Even though he's mekel, you're allowed to walk around. You're allowed to walk around. But there's no heter at all to bring a korban. Like the Rambam, it's more complicated. Since the Rambam says the makam hamikdash has kedusha, and the Rambam paskins like the opinion in Ezra, makriven afal pi she'ein bayis. So, on one hand, you're not allowed to go because you're tamei, but if it's a korban sibor, where we have the principle of tumah hutra b'tzibor, theoretically you could bring a korban on the makam hamizbeach, with the mizbeach, but not a korban yachid, not because that cannot be brought when you're tamei, but a korban sibor, tamid, musaf. And korban pesach has its own rules. Korban pesach is a little different. Korban pesach is actually a korban yachid. It's not a korban sibor. Every individual brings a korban pesach. But there's another rule that if most of the Jewish people are tamei, if only some people are tamei, they got to wait to Pesach Sheni. Right? That's exactly what Pesach Sheni is for. And today, Pesach Sheni doesn't help us because we're going to be Tamei Pesach Sheni too. But if most of the tzibur is Tamei, which is the case today, we are actually permitted to bring a korban Pesach Rishon, and we're allowed to eat from that korban. Which means, according to the Ravid, that's not shayach because there's no mikdash where you could bring the korban. But like the Rambam, you have a kedushas hamikdash. So that would mean, number one, the tamid, the musaf, the hadlakas hamenorah, and the ketores could be done even by kohanim or a tameh. And number two, the korban pesach could be brought under the Pesach version of Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. Again, this is a little confusing. The phrase Tumah Hutra B'tzibur is used both by korban pesach and by korban tamid and musaf, but it actually means a different thing. It's not the same. The Tumah Hutra B'tzibur of Pesach is not the same as the Tumah Hutra B'tzibur of Tamid. Don't confuse them. They actually are two different scenarios. The Tumah Hutra B'tzibur of Korban Tamid does not require that most of the congregation be Tamid. It simply says, Kohanim can do the Avodah of Shechita and Zerika Satamid even though they're in a state of Tumah. You're not referring to the status of the rest of Am Yisrael. That's the Tumah Hutra B'tzibur of Tamid, of Musaf, of Menorah, of Ketores. That Kohanim, who are Tameh, can do the Avodah. The Tumah Hutra B'tzibur of Pesach is a different, right? People get mixed up. A lot of people confuse it. It's a different rule of Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, and this depends on the people as a whole. If most of Am Yisrael are Tameh, so then the korban Pesach can be shechted, whatever needs to be burnt can be burnt, and the people who are Tameh are allowed to eat the korban Pesach. Now, because most of us are Tameh, all of us are Tameh, we have that Tumah Hutra B'tzibur as well. So according to the Rambam, it should stand to reason, according to the Rambam, that as long as we have a Mizbeach, which we don't have yet, but as long as you build a proper Mizbeach on a proper location, you would be allowed to bring the Tamid, the Musaf, the lighting of the menorah, the burning of the ketores, and you would be allowed to bring and eat the korban pesach, even bisman hazeh, under the principle of the korban pesach, tumah hudra b'tzibor. But when you're not bringing korbanos, then you're not allowed to even enter that area because of the issur of tumah, right? The chumrah and a kula, right? You understand the... Now, according to the Ravid, you could not bring any korban whatsoever because you don't have a makam hamikdash. Now, the question that was raised is, well, even according to the Ravid, couldn't you build a makeshift structure just like they did there? So that gets into another machlokas, whether building a mikdash requires prophetic authorization. So you get that machlokas. So just to review this very quickly, 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, this very shaila was asked to Rebbe Kiva Eger, the Chassam Sofer, the Aruch Laner, the Binyan Sion, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's Rebbe, and it was asked by a person. There was a great Rav in Europe. His name was Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. And Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, this is before Theodor Herzl, was what you might call, not the first necessarily, but a very active religious Zionist. That in the middle of the 19th century, maybe the early part of the 19th century, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer was proposing a mass return of the Jewish people to Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. And as part of his plan, he was envisioning rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash, or even if we don't rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, the possibility of the reinstitution of korbanos, putting aside the political consequences of that. And he was a big Talmid Chacham. He was not stam a guy. He was a learned person who wrote svarim with sources. But he submitted the shaila to the Gedolei Hador to see what they would say about this whole issue. And as you might expect, even though he was very enthusiastic in proposing these possibilities, the Gedolei Hador rejected it. They said, this is not the right thing to do. And Rebbe Kiva Eger's main argument was that since the permissibility of korbanos is only according to the Rambam Shita and not according to the Ravid, and according to the Ravid, there would be a chiyuv kares of shechutei chutz in any korban. We're not able to do that, right? We're not able to do that. And Rebbe Kiva Eger had a number of other arguments as well. Some of them are technical. We don't know b'diuk where the mizbeach is, where the makam mizbeach is, and if the mizbeach is off, the korbanos are puzzle. We don't know b'diuk who is a kohen. So for duchening and for aliyah l'torah, all right, you say you're a kohen, we believe you. But as I mentioned, when it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, you need more definitive proof. We also have different unresolved machloksim about the details of Big Day Kahuna. How do you make this? How do you make that? And the problem there is that if a Kohen does Avodah in not proper Big Day Kahuna, it's going to be puzzle. So Rebbe Kiva Eger had a number of issues there. Now, the Temple Institute, the Machon HaMikdash, has been working on Big Day Kahuna and all of these different things for a long time. And they claim they've come to certain halachic conclusions. Now, halacha in this matter can I hate to use the word evolve. I don't mean evolve in the sense of changing, but obviously, if 250 years ago somebody said we're not sure about how the Big Day Kahuna was made or what is Kehillas, whatever it is, that can change with time. Now you can't. I mean, let's say Kehillas, right? Big Day Kahuna need Kehillas. That's one thing. If you don't have Kehillas, you can't have Big Day Kahuna. If you don't have Big Day Kahuna, you don't have korbanos. We don't know what Kehillas is. Well, some people say we do know. Now, you can't just, I'm not saying we do know or we don't know. All I'm saying is you can't automatically look at a tshuva that's 250 years old and say, well, he said we don't know, therefore we don't know. That's not a logical connection because they didn't know 250 years ago, and it's possible that we do know now. I'm not saying we do know. All I'm saying is you can't just take something that's hundreds of years ago and use that as ignorance for today. So the Machon HaMikdash takes its position. Obviously, they did something very risky with the Shtei Halechem, which I don't agree with. I don't mean risky because the police may shoot you dead, which could have been a possibility. I mean it's very risky because they're relying on their opinion for Big Day Kahuna. They're relying on their opinion that they are Kohanim. And they are relying on the Shitas HaRambam that this is a Makom HaMikdash. Like the Ravid, like the Ravid, there probably wouldn't have been a problem of Shchudei Chutz because nothing was shechted. But it could very well be there's another Chiyuv Kares called Hala'ah, sacrificing Chutz LaMikdash. And if they're not Kohanim or their Big Day Kahuna are off or the Kehillas identification is in error, they are Chayiv Kares for being a Tameh who enters the Makom HaMikdash according to the Rambam because they don't have the heter of Tuma Hutra B'tzibur. Which means you got to be very to do what they did. You have to be very confident. That's less so when you are simply making trips on the outer perimeter of the Harabayas. Because when you're making trips on the outer perimeter of the Harabayas, all you're saying is this part is not the Makom HaMikdash. And even though some people have questions with that as well, but you can make that judgment with a lot more confidence. With the Shtei Halechem scenario, they entered what was 100% the Makom HaMikdash. Otherwise, the Shtei Halechem wouldn't have counted as a korban. So they had to be confident that they're Kohanim. They had to be confident they had Big Day Kahuna. They had to be confident in Kehillas. They had to be confident that they baked the Shtei Halechem in the right way because there are machloks and Rashi and Tosas and Rambam about that. So that takes a lot of guts. I mean, there are many poskim, even if they are supportive of going on the Harabayas in terms of the outer rim, to actually do a sacrificial avodah in the Makom HaMikdash requires a lot of assumptions for which we can be very uncertain, right? So I know that the people who support Aliyah Harabayas are kind of two minds with regarding the Shtei Halechem. Okay, alrighty. But be it as it may, it actually is connected to Ezra, and the idea is that they show up and they start on Rosh Hashanah. And what's interesting is, another thing that's interesting is that it mentions from Rosh Hashanah, they started with the Tamid and the Musaf, and then they observed the holiday of Sukkot. What's interesting is there's a conspicuous omission in the middle, and it does not mention Yom Kippur. It does not mention that they did the Avodah of Yom Kippur. Now, why is Yom Kippur omitted? You should go from Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. So I have a partial answer, but it's not a complete answer. Since a lot of the Avodah of Yom Kippur involves bringing the blood of the bull and the goat into the Kodesh Kodshei HaKodashim. So if we say they did not yet have a Beis HaMikdash, there's no Kodesh HaKodashim. So that they couldn't do. On the other hand, like the other opinion that says you could be makriv even without a bias, you would still be able to go into the site of the Kodesh HaKodashim. In other words, kishem that there's Kedushas HaMikdash, there's Kedushas Kodesh HaKodashim. And even besides that, what about the korbanos that are brought on the Mizbeach? There are korbanos on Yom Kippur that are brought on the Mizbeach as well. So I'm going to leave that as a question. Why is there an omission of Avodas Yom Kippur? And of course, Avodas Yom Kippur has to be done exclusively by the Kohen Gadol. But so what? We have a Kohen Gadol. Yoshua ben Yotzadak is the Kohen Gadol. So we're going to see a few times in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and in fact, even in the books of Divrei Hayamim earlier, that when it discusses the holiday cycle, the Yom Tov cycle in the Beis HaMikdash, Yom Kippur is often omitted. It emphasizes Rosh Hashanah and the Regalim. Rosh Hashanah, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot. It does not mention Yom Kippur. I have not seen, I mean, listen, the secular Bible critics say what they say. They make the claim that, okay, whatever, that's not Kedai to go over. They claim that things were invented later, which chas v'shalom, we do not believe, but this is what their proofs that they argue from. We, of course, believe that Avodas Yom Kippur dates from Moshe Rabbeinu's time. It's in the Torah, Parshas Acharei Mos. So why is it omitted in describing the cycle in Ezra and in other places? I'll just leave as a tzorech iyun at this particular time. Yeah.
At this point, they don't have any of the other Kalim of the Mikdash, whether that be for, I guess they built, you said this, maybe some sort of stone mizbeach, but they don't have any of the tools used for menorah and other tools, and those, I guess, are not me'akev.
So first of all, keep in mind that when Koresh authorized them, this is Perek Aleph, when Koresh authorized them to return to Eretz Yisrael, he gave them the kalim of the Beis Hamikdash that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered. So they actually came back to Eretz Yisrael with the kalim. Now the question is, what did the kalim include? It certainly included bowls and knives. Did they get back the menorah? It doesn't say. Menorah might not be nichlal as a kli, but still, l'maisa, you are allowed to make a makeshift menorah. It's not ma'akiv. The Gemara in Menachos describes the Chashmonaim, which was during the second Beis Hamikdash, that after the Yavanim had plundered the temple and on Hanukkah they rededicated the Beis Hamikdash, it took a long time till they would be able to make a fancy gold menorah. So it says they made a makeshift menorah of spears that was soldered to wood, whatever it would be. So you can make any type of menorah, and it would actually be kosher. So they could have done that. Yeah.
There was reports in the last 9 months that the menorah was sided in the Vatican vault. Have you heard anything?
I have to check this. This is a rumor that has been on forever. I mean, I certainly remember hearing it in 5th grade, and I'm sure it was hundreds of years before that. You heard that somebody actually cited it?
Yeah, the rabbi went there. Rabbi, there was a student that studied in the 1950s, a Jewish student, I don't know why.
Yeah.
He went to the Vatican to study. They let him go to the basement of the Vatican. He said he saw the menorah. This story came out in 2023.
Well, that would be fascinating. I'll check it. I tell you the truth, I tend not to believe it. I mean, you are correct, of course. We know the menorah was brought to Rome. That's the Arch of Titus, the famous Arch of Titus, which a Jew does not walk under. So if any of you are going to Rome, so number one, avoid the Sistine Chapel, and number two, don't walk under the Arch of Titus. But the Arch of Titus has the great dramatic picture of Jews being led in chains, carrying on their shoulders the plundered menorah of the Beis Hamikdash that was brought as a tribute to Rome. Now, most historians assume, and I think we assume, that is a true depiction, that is what happened. The menorah was brought to Rome, but whether it somehow remained with the Vatican for all of those hundreds of years is, I think, a real question, because it's very likely that it got melted down at some point. Now, there are even rumors that the Vatican has the Aron HaKodesh, but that is almost certainly not true, because the Gemara itself tells us that the Aron HaKodesh was concealed by Yoshio HaMelech before the Churban of the first Beis Hamikdash. Right, the whole Second Temple didn't even have the Aron HaKodesh in the Kodesh HaKodashim. So I don't think the Vatican has the Ark, that's for sure. The menorah is a possibility. I tend to doubt it because things got melted, things got plundered, and the like. By the way, the picture of the Arch of Titus is a bit of a controversial picture because it contradicts the Rambam's drawing of the menorah. You ever see the Chabad menorahs, right, when they put the menorah on top of a car? So the branches of the menorah are not rounded. A typical menorah, like the State of Israel, you have a rounded branch coming from a central stem. In the Rambam's menorah, it comes out like a sharp diagonal. Yeah, it comes out like a spear. And Chabad, in their Hanukkah mobiles, whatever they call them, uses the image of the Rambam as their depiction of the menorah, because the Rebbe felt that if this is what the Rambam said, that's the psak. The problem is, of course, that the Arch of Titus does have the menorah rounded. So who are you going to believe, Rambam or Titus, right? Okay, so one could say, oh, Rambam is better. On the other hand, Titus is a contemporary. This reminds me a little bit of Soloveitchik was once giving a shiur about what you're allowed to have on Pesach. So someone asked him about, does your toothpaste have to be kosher Pesach? So he said, toothpaste does not have to be kosher Pesach because it's not edible by a dog, and anything that even a dog would not eat is not chametz. Right? That's a psak. So one of the students raised his hand and said, well, I have a dog, and I gave my dog toothpaste, and my dog ate it. So how can you say? So Rav Soloveitchik says, who are you going to believe, me or your dog? So one could say, Titus says the menorah is rounded. Well, the Rambam says not. But I understand the Rambam is more reliable than Titus. But on the other hand, this was a contemporary thing. Why would they falsify the picture of the menorah if that's not the way the menorah was? So that's a bit of a kasha. I don't have a complete answer to that. But the Rambam's depiction of the menorah is not the same as the depiction on the arch of Titus. Okay, how did I get onto this? I have no idea. Did anyone remember? Okay, what we were talking about? Okay, but I mentioned that the kalim, in other words, the kalim were returned. The menorah perhaps was not returned, but halachically they could make a makeshift menorah in order to be madlik, as they did in the time of the Chashmonaim. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so Yom Kippur is skipped, as we said. Yeah, we're in Perek Gimel. They built a Mizbeach. They celebrated Chag HaSukkos, the Korban Tamid, Rosh Chodesh, all the Moedei Hashem, and they started from the first day of Tishrei, even though the Mikdash was not built. There may have been a temporary Mikdash, like one Monday Omer, but the building had not been started yet, and the like. Okay. Now, we then have the month of Cheshvan. Right after Tishrei comes the month of Cheshvan, and at this point, for some reason why it took a month, they started assigning the Levium that would be responsible for Shiur. Now, it's hard to know exactly. So what did they do for that month? Now, what is the din of Shira? What is the din of Shira? So the Torah itself says, when korbanos are brought in the Beis HaMikdash by Kaihanim, there are Levium who sing as the korban is being brought. Now, this is not for all the korbanos. If I, as an individual, bring my korban, I don't get a Levi to sing for me. This is really for korbanos sibor, the korban old, the korban tamid, the korban musaf. There is shiras halavim. Now, at what point in the korban is there shiras halavim? So it really is at the very end, because when you bring a korban ola, that's the korban tamid. The korban tamid is a lamb that is slaughtered, that's burnt on the mizbeach. Okay. Then you have a meal offering, a mincha that is burnt, and then you have a wine libation that is poured. Okay, so there's actually three things that are being offered when the korban tamid is brought. There is the animal, there is the mincha, and there is the nisuch hayayin. And this is true for every musaf as well. Every animal of the musaf had a mincha and a nisuch hayayin. The shiur of the Levium is while the wine is being poured. When the Kohen is pouring wine on the Mizbeach, there are actually holes in which the wine drained into those holes. That is when the Levium would be singing. So they weren't singing during the Shechita or the Zrika Sadam or the burning of the meat. They were singing during Nisuch Hayayin, and this is the original meaning of the statement, Ein, Warren Brachos, Ein Omrim Shira Ella Al Hayayin. So even though we interpret that to mean you make Kiddush on wine and everything else, its original meaning was the singing of the Beis HaMikdash is on wine. Okay. Now, what did they sing? So first of all, it is both vocal music and instrumental music. Okay, some Levium sang, some Levium played instruments, whether it's flute, harp, some type of violin type instrument, navel, vachinor. The exact translations actually elude us a little bit. They were not the same instruments that we're totally familiar with, but some of them do overlap. A drum, and some Levium were singers, and some Levium were musicians. And depending on the instrument, if you're doing a drum or something, you could be a singer and a musician at the same time. What did they, by the way, they did this even on Shabbos, because remember, on Shabbos, you're doing a gazillion malachas anyway. You're shechting and cooking, so you play music. I think I mentioned that is why when the Reform movement started with their innovations, they would call their synagogues temples. They still do. Because the very first innovation of the Reform movement was somewhat innocuous, very innocuous. They simply introduced the playing of an organ during services. And in fact, in some of the more Haredi Reform congregations, they insisted that it be a non-Jewish organist. Wasn't even a Jew. But they would have a non-Jewish organist play, because that's what Protestant churches did. And their argument was, in the Beis HaMikdash, they played instruments on Shabbos, and every synagogue is a miniature Beis HaMikdash. So the word temple was used specifically to legitimate the relatively minor reform of playing instrumental music in the Beis Knesses on Shabbos. Eventually, the Reform movement became much, much worse than that. But the initial was a very, it was against halacha, but it was a relatively minor infraction, meaning men and women were separated and they had a Hebrew service, but they played music. Yeah, in the back.
So, Rabbi, what would be the halachic issue that if the Beis Medrash you would play music in on Shabbat? What would be the issue then of the synagogue?
Yeah, well, the issue is this. The issue is that why can't any of us, forget about synagogue for a moment. Why can't I play my guitar on Shabbos? What malacha, which of the 39 malachos am I violating by playing the piano or guitar or the flute or the clarinet? The answer is it's only a rabbinic decree. The rabbinic decree is we don't want you to play musical instruments because if a string breaks, you might fix it, and then you transgress the prohibition of making a vessel on Shabbos. So it's a gezerah d'Rabbanan, don't play the musical instrument lest you come to fix it. Now there's a general rule that rabbinic decrees don't apply to the temple service. So as a result, what you're allowed to do in the temple is not what you're allowed to do in a shul. A shul does not have the leniencies of the Beit Knesset, right? But the Reform movement wanted to use the word temple to kind of create that legitimacy. Now, in terms of halakhic violation, that's a relatively minor violation, but it led to obviously more serious issues that came down the pike. Okay, so Levium are both instrumentalists, musicians, and singers. What do they sing? So interestingly enough, the Torah does not require any particular script. They could make up their own song, although I assume they would have to coordinate that. You can't sing your song, you sing your song. But in other words, the Torah does not give you a script. Later, and perhaps only in the second Beis HaMikdash, Tehillim was used, and this is the Shiur of the day, etc. But that is not a Torah requirement. The Torah does not require that it be Tehillim. There was no Tehillim in the Torah. The Torah just says they sing in their own way. So the script, the Torah leaves wide open, although later Tehillim became the official script. What was the tune? What was the tune, right? So we know, at least in later times, what they sang, Tehillim, by and large. Although there's one exception to Tehillim, and that is on Shabbos, when they would bring the Musaf of Shabbos, they actually sang Parshas Hazinu. This is the only shiur that's from the Torah. All the other shiuros are Tehillim. Shabbos Musaf was Hazinu, which they would divide up. Okay, but be it as it may, what was the nigun? So the truth is we don't know, frankly, because frankly it is very, very difficult to construct ancient music of any kind, because the notation systems were either non-existent or were very different. I mean, what did Greek music sound like? What did Babylonian music sound like? So in many, many ways, we have no way of knowing what the music sounded like. Now, there are two possibilities that have been suggested. Possibility number one is that the music that was used in the Beis Hamikdash corresponds, at least for those chapters of Tehillim, to the trup of Tehillim. Now, you know what trup is, right? We know the Torah has musical notes, the Nevi'im have musical notes, and Tehillim has musical notes. Now, in truth, the three books of Kesuvim, Iyov, Mishlei, Tehillim, they're called Sifrei Emes, books of truth, Emes, but Iyov, Mishlei, Tehillim. So they do have the same squiggles as the rest, but they have different significances and they're sung differently. Some people claim they have a Messiah, some say well, there's no Messiah, some say we don't know that was sung. Might be able to find it. But some suggest that the trup was in fact the musical system that the Levium employed. So if I want to know what they sounded like, so I'll look up the Tehillim that they sang that day, and assuming I could reconstruct the trup, which is not so simple, but there are those who do reconstruct it, that's what it sounded like. They used the trup, Sifrei Emes. Of course, that wouldn't tell you what they used when they were not using Tehillim, so, but okay. And that would also mean, according to that, on Shabbos Musaf, when they read Hazinu, they read it like a Torah reading, the Torah trup, Hazinu. So that's one view. There's another view that says that the trup has nothing to do with the Beis Hamikdash. The trup is, when I read Tehillim, I would read it with the trup. But in the Beis Hamikdash, they had their own form of singing. And the suggestion has been made, although some think it's heretical, that the old Gregorian chants, right? Gregorian chants are very, very ancient and old musical chants of the Catholic Church that are still utilized, lahavdil, in their services. And some have said that although the Gregorian chants officially date from Pope Gregory, that's only in the, I think, the 1400s, not so long ago, but they say Gregory was actually using very, very ancient chants. And some say that these were chants of the Levium that were brought to Rome at the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, that just like the church may have taken the menorah, they may have taken some snitches of the music. So I don't know what to tell you. Should I advise that you listen to Gregorian chants? I'm not really sure. On one hand, it is part of Christian worship today. On the other hand, some say it is so ancient that it actually might be at least fragments of the Shiras HaLevim. So we do have these two opinions. Some say it's the trup, which in itself might be difficult to even find. Some say Gregorian chants. Others say we just don't know. Yeah.
Really quick, what did trap mean?
Didn't hear you.
I'm not familiar with the term trap.
Oh, trup. Yeah, so trup is Yiddish. It's simply the musical notation system, right? If you look in a Chumash, right, so you'll notice in addition to vowels, right, you see, yeah, so those are notes. So if you lay and if you read the Torah, so you know how to sing the words, right? So based on these squiggles are the musical notation system for how to sing the verses. Now, there is one way of singing the Torah. There's one way of singing the prophetic books. There's one way of singing the 5 Megillos. And then for the words, for the books of Mishlei Tehillim, there's another way of singing, but many say we've lost that tradition. Some say we have it. So trup is simply the Yiddish word for the musical notation system of the Tanakh.
I was going to suggest, perhaps a way to get around the possibility of listening to idolatry music is to run that music through AI compared to Tehillim's same different interpretations, and see how the AI would rate the similarities between the vowels.
Okay, well, you could try that. I mean, AI has some very great potentials, but obviously, in some ways, AI itself is only as good as the human input of the internet sites that it scours, right? So essentially, AI will be based on the speculations of people who may in fact not be right. AI is not Nevuah, it's not Ruach HaKodesh. AI itself is based on human conclusions, which themselves may be erroneous. Yeah.
I'm surprised that you saying that they say Hazino. Interesting choice because it just has a lot of Musar in it. It's very harsh, and it feels like for Shabbos it should be like something more.
Yeah, it is interesting. In fact, it mentions that Hazina was divided into small portions, and they would rotate it every 6 weeks, and they would finish the parsha not with 7, but with six segments. And you are correct. It is Hazinu does talk about the Jewish people sinning and the punishments that will befall the Jewish people. It could very well be. It's a good point. It could very well be that precisely on Shabbos, when people take it easy and people relax and people feel less pressured, they need to be reminded of their responsibilities, that Shabbos shouldn't just be a day of eating, sleeping, and drinking, but you need to acknowledge HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
This is more of a historical comment that's out of interest, which is that you mentioned that the church modes might have been similar to some of the Beis Medrash, so the church groups
Yeah.
which use a modal system,
Yeah.
as far as from the Greeks. And historically speaking, the oldest intact surviving song is 2,000 years old, has been inscribed in stone, called the Kehillas epitaph. It was found in Turkey, on the Turkey that's in Greek, as part of a burial, as I think right there. And that also used a modal system. So we could
So,
hypothesize
yeah.
that even though the 1400s you mentioned the church mode was written down, that's a historical
Mhm.
pin on the board that uses also the same modal system. And that's
Right. Yeah. No, it is fascinating. To me, how somebody deciphers what music sounded like 2,000 years ago is actually, to me, it's a miraculous. I don't even understand. It's a miraculous process. Like, how on earth do you figure it out without a standardized notation? But you are correct.
It has a notation.
Yeah, they have identified this old ancient song. Now, the reason I'm bringing up the Levium is the following. It's an interesting issue. It's a little confusing to me because it mentions they didn't get around to organizing the roster of the Levium until the second month. Now, the second month might mean Cheshvan, meaning right after Sukkot, or it might even mean Eor, because often we count from Nisan. So if they were doing the Avodah from Rosh Hashanah, but they didn't organize the roster of the Levium until either Cheshvan or Eor, depending on what Chodesh Hasheni is, then what were they doing? How were the Levium singing until the roster? Is there an implication that there was no Shira until then? But that's not proper. So it could very well be that even without a roster, you can have ad hoc. Whichever Levi shows up gets to sing. So which means that there were a few months in which it was a free for all. There was Shira, but there was not an organized commitment. And then eventually, Yoshua ben Yotzadok administratively wanted to have a steady supply of Levium. So then there was the assignment of roster. Now, all I'm saying is the creation of a roster does not suggest there was no Shira until then. It simply says the Shira was informal and the like. And then it says, at some point, they began to lay the foundation of the second Beis HaMikdash. Now they're beginning construction. So once again, they began korbanos before they began construction, although maybe they had a makeshift. But now they are miyased. Miyased, they build a foundation of the Heichal. They are going ahead and building the Beis HaMikdash, and it talks about the huge celebration. But here we have a very famous pasuk that I'm sure you've heard of before, and it says, remember, this is around 52 years after the Churban, not 70, 52 years after the Churban, maybe 53 years by now. So there were older people who still remembered. If you were 70 years old, you were 17 when the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. You remembered the first Beis HaMikdash. So the young people were shouting and singing in great joy. And the old people were sobbing and weeping because they remembered the physical and the spiritual glory of the first temple. And they saw this was so inferior. And it mentions, perhaps a little bit exaggeratingly, that the crying of the old people was louder than the joyous singing of the young people. The crying disabled the hearing of the Son. Because remember, the second Beis Hamikdash didn't have an Aron HaKodesh. It didn't have Nevuah. It didn't have Urim V'Tumim. Things were missing. It didn't have the same Kedusha. Right? So that's a famous verse. But be it as it may, we end Perek Gimel with they're beginning to construct the Beis Hamikdash. This is great. Perek Dalet will give us the story how the whole project got aborted, canceled, ceased because of accusations made by enemies of the Jews. And that's why it's going to be put on hold for 18 years. Okay? So we'll stop here. We'll see you later. Yep.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.